When I was in elementary school, I loved to read as much as I do now. I remember sitting on the school bus reading my favorite books in the whole world, The Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. I had no idea that C.S. Lewis was a Christian author or that the books were an invitation to a relationship with God through the great lion Aslan, who was a child's fairy tale version of Jesus. All I knew was I loved Aslan and I wished he were real. I cried when Aslan was executed in this humiliating way, Narnia's version of crucifixion on the stone table. And I rejoiced with the girls, Susan and Lucy, who were the child's version of the women by the cross, the next morning when they found he was resurrected and even more alive than he ever had been. I had no idea. Reading these books gave me a doorway into the fantasy world of Narnia. As surely as the door of the wardrobe in the first book, C.S. Lewis opened a secret door in my heart to the sure presence of God's realm of justice and mercy and love. I've told you before the story of how when I was 13, I decided to follow Jesus. A couple of years after I became Christian, after I had started reading the Bible and especially the Gospels and was a little bit familiar with them, I started to reread the Narnia books as a teenager. And I came to this scene at the end of the third book, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, in which, after a long ocean voyage, these children arrive on a beach by the sea, and on the beach, they see a lamb cooking a breakfast of fish and bread over a charcoal fire. And the lamb says to them, "Come and have breakfast." I wish I could describe the seismic shift that happened within me at that moment when I saw the words of Jesus in this gospel story in my favorite childhood book. It was like an earthquake in my consciousness as I realized that Aslan, the great lion that I loved, was actually a child's version of Jesus. Aslan, who steadfastly accompanies the children and protects them through all their adventures. Aslan, who sacrificed himself for the sake of a foolish, sinful boy and was resurrected. Aslan, who welcomed all people who earnestly sought him, even followers of other gods. And I recalled the words of Aslan in this very book, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, where he tells Edmund and Lucy they can never come back to Narnia because they're too old. And they say, "Oh, we don't care about Narnia, but we're so sad we can't see you." And he says, "I am in your world also, and you must come to know me in your world." It was then that I discovered that C.S. Lewis had written not just the Narnia books for children, but a whole bunch of other books, both fiction and nonfiction, for grown-ups. And I was thrilled. And now I get to read C.S. Lewis all the time. His Christian universalist thought has deeply shaped my own theology. He believed that our concept of God must be shattered again and again because God is the great iconoclast. He wrote that one of the marks of God's presence is the shattering of our image of God. Every time we think we have a handle on who God is, God shifts the ground, and we have to surrender more and more to our faith in the holy mystery. So you can imagine that this little story from the Bible at the very end of John's gospel is very dear to me because it's echoed in Narnia. It's a dreamlike sequence, and it takes place after the end of the original gospel. If you look at the end of chapter 20 of the Gospel of John, this is chapter 21. The very end of chapter 20 which is what we heard last week with when Jessica preached about how Jesus appears to the disciples in Jerusalem. It says Jesus performed many other signs as well, signs not recorded here, but these have been recorded to help you believe that Jesus is a Messiah, so you may have life. All that's missing is the end. It's clearly the end of the book. Another reason we know that this is a totally separate thing is the action shifts suddenly from Jerusalem. All the action has been taking place in Jerusalem. Jesus was crucified. He came back and appeared to Mary. Then they're all hiding in that locked room in Jerusalem where Jesus appeared. Suddenly we're back at the shore of Lake Tiberias, which is the name the Romans gave to the Sea of Galilee. Renaming bodies of water is not a new thing for autocratic governments to do. So the Sea of Galilee, or the Lake Tiberias, is like 80 or 90 miles away from Jerusalem. So suddenly the next day they happen to be at Lake Tiberias? No, it's a different, totally different thing. So why? Why is there this add-on? This strange magical echo of the story that we first read in Luke's gospel, the miraculous catch of fish. In Luke's gospel, the story is about the calling of the disciples for the first time. This version, which is kind of an epilogue to the Gospel of John, presents the same story of the miraculous catch of fish in a new light in order to shatter our original idea of Jesus and be drawn more deeply into the heart of God. This little chapter was probably written, most scholars believe, about 30 years after the original Gospel of John was written, by a completely different author, probably. An author who wanted to remind readers of the call of the disciples at a time in history when followers of Jesus probably felt despair. Their original image of God, of Jesus, of the Messiah, of what would happen to them had been shattered. And this story seeks a new vision of God's realm that can only be found in the broken pieces. John's gospel was the last of the four gospels to be written, probably around the year 90, which is 20 years after the Romans had destroyed the temple. In the 30 years between the writing of the original gospel, 90-ish, to 120, and the addition of this little story, the Romans had been unrelenting in their wars against the Jews. And remember, the early Christians were mostly Jews, and they were considered to be sort of a cult within Judaism. So the Romans didn't discriminate in their persecution of Jews and Christians. Anybody who refused to acknowledge Caesar as a god or worship him. These Roman wars had lasted for about 70 years. Imagine 70 years of war. Like the war in Ukraine, I think, has been like 3 years. Imagine 70 years. Each new wave began with a Jewish leader who would claim to be the Messiah, gather an armed rebellion, and restore the kingdom of Israel. The Romans became more and more extreme in their repression. They destroyed the temple. They destroyed Jerusalem. They carried people away into slavery. They crucified hundreds of people. They began to destroy other Jewish towns. They leveled all the towns where the disciples were from in Galilee. Again and again, these would-be messiahs would rise up and then be crushed by the Romans. Now, the earliest Christians believed that Jesus was this kind of messianic leader. It's true he'd been crucified and killed, but his followers held on to a belief that Jesus would return imminently within their lifetimes and restore the kingdom of Israel. In the decades immediately after Jesus' death, the early Christian communities clung to the hope that they didn't have long to wait before God would come riding in and clean things up and end their suffering. But now, 80 or 90 years after Jesus lived, their hopes are shattered. Most of the original disciples are dead. They've either died of old age or they've been killed. There have been 70 years of continuous war, oppression, famine, disease. Many people have left the area, scattered throughout the empire. C.S. Lewis describes this same shattering feeling in his book, A Grief Observed, written after the death of his wife. He writes, "Meanwhile, where is God? Go to him when your need is desperate, when all other help is vain, and what do you find? A door slammed in your face, a sound of double bolting on the inside. After that, silence. You may as well turn away. There are no lights in the windows. It might be an empty house. Was it ever inhabited? It seemed so once. What can this mean?" The author of this epilogue to the Gospel of John was writing in this atmosphere of weariness, despair, and doubt. It's not surprising that this story begins with Peter saying, "I'm going back to work. How can I continue to hope for Jesus' return? Continue to do the day in and day out labor of caring for this little Christian community, gathering for worship, singing hymns, collecting, distributing funds for people who are needy?" Peter and the disciples go out fishing all night long and they catch nothing. What a perfect metaphor for the shattering of their hopes. It's night, it's dark, the unknown has surrounded them, and they can't even succeed at the work that they were trained to do, the work they'd been experienced in before Jesus called them into the crazy new way of life. That empire overshadows them. The Chronicles of Narnia were written during World War II in the shadow of fascism. In the first book, the four children are evacuated from London to go stay with an old professor in his country house. It's in a spare room in this country house where Lucy finds the wardrobe that is the portal to Narnia for the first time. Amid the fear, amid the despair, amid the darkness of world war, the four children discover a magic country, Aslan's country, where they are invited into a relationship with a God who is larger than any world, who shines brighter than any darkness, and who invites them to come and have breakfast. In this magical story, at the end of John's Gospel, the dawn breaks. Jesus is there, although they don't recognize him at first. Maybe they were expecting a mighty warrior, a Messiah with a sword. Instead, he's got a spatula and he's cooking. He gives them a miraculous catch of fish, big, enormous fish, the gospel says. These are the kind of fish that were served at Roman banquets for the wealthiest folk. The fishers would save the big fish to send to the highfalutin people in Rome and just eat the little tiny fish themselves. But here Jesus cooks these big, enormous fish for them. Even in the darkness of empire, of fear, of hopelessness, he says, "Come and have breakfast." C.S. Lewis summed up his Christian faith with this phrase: "We have learned not to take present things at their face value." In the shadow of empire, of fascism today, of fear, we accept Christ's invitation to breakfast. The risen Christ appears to us in the unlikeliest of places. God has to smash our illusions again and again, our expectations about who and what God is and how God will appear. Roman imperial banquets often end with a demand that guests take a loyalty oath. After feeding you, Caesar would ask for obedience. But after this simple breakfast, Jesus takes Peter aside and asks for two things: cherish him and care for others. Do you love me? Do you cherish me? Feed my lambs, tend my sheep. The author of this beautiful little epilogue to John's Gospel reminds us that Jesus shows up when and where and how we least expect, not with violence, but with tenderness, not with battle, but with breakfast. Amen.